Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with a book review for a book that I read very recently, which is Killed, Great Journalism Too Hot to Print, edited by David Wallis. This is a collection of about 25 articles that were killed before they went to publication, which is to say the piece was commissioned, the writer wrote it, turned it in, and then prior to the publication, the editor or management or whoever in charge decided that they didn't want the piece to be printed. This does also include a few stories that were published at later dates. I think there are only a couple of them included, but they're called underpublished. For example, George Orwell's book review, which was considered unpatriotic in the 40s. But overall, most of these articles had never been printed before. I gave this book 4 stars, and I found it really entertaining. It's one of those books that pretty much is exactly what you think it's going to be. It's a collection of articles that were killed before they went to publication. And I think if you think you'll enjoy that, you will. I will say that the title is very sensationalist, which I don't think would come as a surprise to anyone. Too hot to print is a bit of an exaggeration. A number of these articles were killed for other reasons that weren't exactly scandalous in nature. Sometimes editors get fired and new editors are hired in, and they really don't want anything to do with the pet projects of the people who came before them. Sometimes a piece just doesn't align with the political beliefs of the magazine and newspaper. A lot of small things. I don't hate the title for that. I think it's kind of expected that it's exaggerating slightly. I think most titles do, just to sort of grab your attention. But it is something going in if you think this is going to be full of super scandalous, dramatic articles, because it's really not. There were a few that were killed for more dramatic reasons, like, hey, we're going to get sued if we print this, or this is an unpatriotic article, so we can't print that, or a number of things like that. But I think for the most part it was more just like, this is a 50-page article and we really don't want a 50-page article in our magazine. The biggest problem I had with this book was sort of the lack of commentary in it. I went into this knowing that there was commentary for each article and being very interested in what David Wallis or whoever wrote the commentary had to say, why it was chosen, what was the significance of it, background on the writer, background on the topic itself, historical context, why it was killed, etc., etc. I was kind of expecting a lot, and I didn't get that. I got about 2 to 3 paragraphs per piece, usually written by the writer who'd written the article itself, which was an interesting addition. But pretty much the only commentary was the journalist kind of guessing and speculating why exactly a piece was killed. Because when pieces are killed, sometimes you get the exact literal reason, and sometimes the editor will just say something like, oh, we're not really a fan of the writing, we'd have to do some major edits, etc., etc., when what they really mean is, we don't want this in our magazine. And that did disappoint me, because I was really looking forward to the commentary aspect. But I got over that disappointment fairly quickly, but ran into another issue with the lack of commentary, which is that these articles cover a very wide range of topics and a very wide range of years. The earliest article printed in this was from 1942, and the latest was from 2003. The topics ranged from book and movies to Israel's conflict in the Middle East, to the Clintons, to feminism, to exposés on controversial companies, to satire. It was a very broad range of topics, which I enjoyed. But when there was very little commentary on them, I found that I lacked context. A lot of them were from the 90s. I would say the majority were. There were about a third that were before the 90s and maybe almost a third that were after. And I was born in 93, which means, considering it stopped in 2003 when I was 10, I really don't have any kind of context for any of these. The way journalism works is that you don't really need the context because it's being published in a timely manner. And this was not published in a timely manner. So without that context, I found myself very confused at times. I had to do a lot of outside research to kind of understand what they were talking about. Like, if they're talking about a movie that I've never seen, I really would have liked sort of a brief overview at the beginning. Like, not 10 pages worth of commentary, like I initially wanted, kind of, but just a little bit of an overview to give me that context that I lacked. Because I did struggle with that, and for most of these pieces, I really had to do a lot of research. I think going in, especially if you're a younger person and didn't live through a lot of the 80s and the 90s and aren't already aware of a number of these topics, you're probably going to have to know that going in, you will have to do outside research. That's kind of a given with this book, unless you're okay with just like not understanding things entirely, which I'm not. It really bothers me to not be able to understand things. So I spent a lot of time on Wikipedia when reading this. It took me about a month and a half to read because I had to pause like with every article and go on Wikipedia, Google a number of things and Google the author and like kind of figure out what was the context behind the piece, what was sort of the background information that I needed to know to fully understand the piece. I just think a little bit more commentary would have really fixed that and made this a much more enjoyable experience. But if you're going in just looking at the articles and knowing that the articles are pretty much by themselves, I think you'll like that. As with any anthology, the articles are kind of hit or miss. Some of them I really loved, some of them were fantastic. I really enjoyed Betty Friedan's article, Are Women Wasting Time in College?, which was written in 1958 and inspired her book The Feminine Mystique, which I now really want to read. I hadn't really heard much about it except in passing, but just based on the statistics she found and what she'd written in this article, I really want to know more. Money Changes Everything, Coming to Terms with Father's Day by Ted Rall was also a surprisingly touching article. It was about his estranged relationship with his father and how he wanted no contact with his father, how money had ruined their relationship and that he was not okay with that, but he was okay with no further contact, and it was to be published on Father's Day until it was decided that maybe that was a little bit negative for Father's Day. John Enteen's article on The Body Shop was incredibly enlightening, and maybe not for the industry as a whole. It kind of said a lot of things like they ignore FDA rulings, they don't test their products as much as they should, they abuse people in third world countries that are kind of obvious and expected for most companies, but just the level of hypocrisy with The Body Shop was kind of astounding and much higher than I even come to expect from the general ethics conscious company. I highly recommend looking into that if you're interested in anything about The Body Shop. And it's interesting that the two articles I enjoyed the most were both very critical of Israel's role in the conflict of the Middle East. Remember the Wives by Robert Fisk was incredibly well done, and it was critical not only of Israel, but also the way the conflict is covered, especially by American journalists, and how it's so skewed and biased in favor of Israel. And he gets down into the words that are used, like neighborhoods versus settlements, or targeted killings versus assassinations, when it comes to talking about the Israelis versus the Palestinians. And I found that very, very interesting to read. And then Mike Sager's Travels with Basim was probably one of the best things I've read this year. If I could add that to my best list of the year, I think I could, just because it was about a 50-page article on a Palestinian refugee camp. And he met this man, Basim, and followed him around and basically talked to him and used him to talk to other people. And it was fascinating and so well written, and just one of those articles that I really can't imagine why anyone wouldn't want to publish that, even though it's 50 pages long and kind of ridiculous in that way. But it was so incredibly well done and incredibly engrossing. 50 pages just went by in a blink. I'd highly recommend trying to find that story if you can anywhere online. I don't know if it is available or if you have to read it in this book, but it was honestly amazing. Those two articles really made me interested in reading more on Israel's conflict in the Middle East, especially things that are critical of Israel. I've never really read anything, and I'm coming from a level of extreme ignorance on the topic. I don't think I know more than the average American, which is not very much. But they were both my favorite, and the fact that I've never read anything else kind of tells me that I should look more into it. There were also a number of articles I didn't enjoy quite as much as those, and I'm not going to list all of them because that just seems pointless, but I think with any anthology, some are hits and some are misses, and there were a number of misses in here, but that was fine. That's to be expected. And I do find that I particularly have trouble with satire. I just don't enjoy satire. I understand it for the most part. I understand what is being satirized and what the point is, but just because I understand it doesn't mean I enjoy it. And I think that's one of the reasons I struggled with Orwell's Animal Farm. Satire kind of goes over my head as to why it exists. Most of the articles that I didn't really enjoy have kind of faded pretty fast, which I think is pretty par for the course when it comes to newspaper articles. If you don't really love them, they fade. But overall, this book was very worthwhile. It was very interesting. I think if this sounds like something you'll enjoy, you probably will. There really isn't anything surprising about this. It's just a bunch of articles that were killed for various reasons. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars because I just don't think it was quite everything that I wanted it to be. It was a very good book, and one that I'm very, very glad I picked up. Just not a favorite for me, although I do think I will return to this and read some of the articles again. Let me know down below if you've read this book or if you're planning to read it, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.